John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you'll get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We're not reading Hellblazer number 70, which is where you thought we were going to go, because I found out while searching for some images for issue 70 that there's actually a little story in between from a book called Vertigo Jam. And this is actually included in the trade paperback of this storyline, so I figured I'd just do an episode with it. Vertigo Jam is actually like a bunch of small stories of all the Vertigo titles, and they're all in continuity for those titles. So in this one issue, there's a story for Sandman, Hellblazer, Animal Man, Doom Patrol, Swamp Thing, Kid Eternity, and Shade the Changing Man. And as a Hellblazer fan, I didn't even know this thing existed, so now I gotta go track this issue down so I can complete my run of Hellblazer. But before we get into that, just a little catch up on what's been going on. In the last couple issues, John has been dumped by his girlfriend Kit, and he's been left by his best friend Chaz, and he's been feeling so bad that he's been living on the streets, panhandling during the day, and using that money to drink as often as possible. He basically just wants to forget everything that was involved with his life with Kit and Chaz. And in the last issue in particular, we saw John defeat the King of the Vampires just when it looked like this was it for John. He was going to die. He's at his lowest point, and he's almost welcoming death in that moment. The King of the Vampires bit him, but unfortunately, he does not do well with demon blood. And while the King of the Vampires was dying, or his face was actually melting off from the tainted blood of John Constantine, we saw a glimpse of the old John who was enjoying this scene play out where the King of the Vampires thought he was going to kill John. He did not, and then John dragged him out into the sunlight and watched him burn. But immediately following that, we did see John kind of revert back to his depressed self as the memories started to come back about Kit and Chaz, and we were left with John getting drunk and walking around the streets of London amongst the other homeless people. And that's pretty much where this one picks up. So first things first, we got the cover for Vertigo Jam number 1. We see all the different characters from all the different stories inside are hanging out together on a street corner, and they're in front of a flower shop that says flowers and herbs, but inside the window we can see Swamp Thing is looking out. And then there's a balcony just above that, and we see Morpheus, and I believe it's Kid Eternity. We see John Constantine sitting at a table drinking a beer, and next to him, I believe it's Buddy Baker, the Animal Man. And then behind them is Shade the Changing Man. And then walking on the street past that table is Dorothy and Cliff from Doom Patrol. And all the names of the creators from the stories inside the book are hovering above Cliff's head. And we see this Hellblazer story is written by Garth Ennis with art by Steve Dillon. And the name of the Hellblazer story inside is called Tainted Love. And as we turn to the Hellblazer story inside, we start off in a construction site in one of those giant cement tubes for drainage. And it hasn't been placed in the ground yet. It is just sitting on top of the ground. So we see John and another man are sitting inside of it, and they're drinking. And by John's beard, we can definitely tell that this is still homeless John. He's still in the same spot he was in the last issue. And we see the man sitting with him is drinking a bottle of Jack Daniels. And he says to John, "Do a friggin' trick then." And John says, "What?" And the man replies, "You say you're a magician, right? Do a trick." And John says, "Oh, piss off, Coney. I just said it because, oh shit, I mean, just give us a swig, Coney. Come on, it's bloody freezing." So it seems John did not make out well today, panhandling, and he doesn't have any booze. And of course, because he's always trying to be perpetually drunk so he doesn't have to remember what happened with Kit and Chaz, he's trying to bum liquor off this guy named Coney. So Coney says to John, "Lucky old me, huh? Cunahan falls asleep before he can drink his jack, and I just chance along." And then Coney raises the bottle to taunt John and shakes it and says, "Looks good. Tell us a story then, Magic One." And then he takes a big gulp out of the bottle, and John watches him and says, "Give us a swig if I do." And as Coney drinks, he says, "Mm-hmm." And as we turn the page, we get a flashback as John starts his story. We see John walking the streets of London, and this is the young, dapper John that we're normally used to with his trench coat, and he's wearing a suit underneath with a tie and everything, and he's got a cigarette in his mouth, and his hair's short, and he doesn't have a beard. And the narration says, "This is a long time ago, right? Bloody ages." Then we see John walk into a pub, and he walks over to a table where there's a man talking to a couple women. And John's narration says, "Mate of mine called Seth. Real smooth operator. Had to beat the birds off with a big shitty stick. Not that I had much trouble in that department. Suppose that's why we got on so well, you know? Eye for the ladies. Fun for the lads, bullshitting about scoring and tarts, and Thirsty Kirsty's good for a screw." So as John approaches the table, Seth sees him and introduces him to the ladies, saying, "Barbara, Martha, this is me mate John." And John looks at the ladies and says, "Evening." And then the ladies excuse themselves to use the restroom, and as they walk away and out of earshot, John says to Seth, "Just sitting here, were they?" And Seth answers, "Yep, which one do you fancy?" And before we get any further, I'll describe the ladies. Martha is a black woman who's got short hair, like 80s short. She kind of looks like Grace Jones. And Barbara is a white woman with long blonde hair, and they're both just young, attractive women, basically. So in response to which one he fancies, John answers, "Martha." And Seth replies, "Piss off. You can have Blondie, mate." And as John lights a cigarette, he says, "You're joking. She's thick as pig shit." And then Seth lights himself a cigarette and he says, "A tenor says I get Martha before you." And John says, "Arsehole." And Seth replies, "I'm serious. Make it more interesting." And John thinks for a second, and he's got like a sly smile on his face, and he says, "Done." And then as we turn the page, we see John is walking out with the black woman Martha, and he's got a smile on his face, and he's looking back at Seth as Seth is walking out with Barbara, the white woman, and he's giving John the finger. And John's narration says, "Thing with Seth was, he could be a right bastard when he wanted. He treated some of the girls like shit. He just wasn't one for talking stuff out. If a girl pissed him off, he'd be cruel as hell." Then we get a couple panels showing this where we see Seth has just had sex with a woman. She's sitting up in bed naked, covering herself, and he is getting dressed, and she's saying, "That's it? You're going?" And then Seth says, "Uh-huh." And then he reaches in his pocket and turns around, and he throws some money at her. So Seth is definitely a big asshole, especially when it comes to women. So we cut back for a second as John is talking to Coney at the construction site, and he says to Coney, "You'd find these girls at parties or wherever, crying their eyes out. I'd bollock him about it, but..." Then we cut to the past where he's telling the story again, and we see John is just finishing giving Seth a talking to about the way he treats women, and Seth is saying, "Don't talk shit, mate. Screw him and leave him. That's my motto." Then John watches as sometime later he sees Seth chatting up another woman, and the narration says, "But Jesus, he was me mate. You let your pals off with some ridiculous bloody things sometimes. Dodgy remarks, ropey ideas. Frigate, it's one of the things friendship's about. And maybe you see some of the bad stuff in yourself, and you keep your mouth shut." So even though John doesn't like his friend's attitude towards women and the way he acts towards them, John is no stranger to one-night stands, and, he's not known for treating women the best either sometimes. So then we cut to another night where John and Seth are at a bar, and there's a woman standing behind them talking to a friend, and they're noticing her, and John's narration says, "And then there was Annette." And then as John and Seth check Annette out from afar, John says, "Dear, dear, dear, that shouldn't be allowed." And Seth is saying in response, "Jesus frickin' Christ almighty." And I guess Annette is definitely their kind of woman. Like, she's the hottest thing ever to them. And I should say, definitely the way Steve Gillen draws her, she's very attractive. She's a young white woman with raven black hair that comes just past her ears. And she's just wearing a black t-shirt and some jeans. Nothing skimpy or revealing, but something about the way Steve Gillen draws her just makes her very striking on the page. So as John and Seth watch her from afar, Seth says to John, "Mine, Gotta be. And John is amused by this and he says, "Get wired in, mate. Emma's over tomorrow." So John doesn't even try because at this point he's dating someone named Emma. And we see throughout the night, John is just watching them from afar, smiling as Seth talks to Annette, and his narration says, "She was a language student from Calais on some exchange thing or other. She was drop dead bloody gorgeous, and old Seth was in like Flynn. I was in the States for a while, but when I got back, Seth and Annette were bloody well living together. This was closer than the friggard got to anyone, right? I couldn't believe my eyes." Then we cut to John and Seth in a pub, and as John drinks, he says, "So what happened to screw him and leave him?" And Seth replies, "Jesus, no, mate. Not with her. She's..." And then he looks down at his watch and says, "Look, I gotta go anyway. She's cooking tonight." And John just stares at him as Seth says this, with a look on his face that says, "Really?" And Seth sees the look and he says, "Piss off. It's not like that at all." And John replies, "Bloody well sounds like a chum." And then Seth gets kind of bashful and he looks down at the ground and he says, "It's not, mate. She's the one." Then we get a panel of the homeless John looking straight forward and he says, "She wasn't. Seth gave a party about a week later. Halfway through, the shit hit the fan." And then we cut to the night of that party and we see Seth and Annette are arguing in a room and the door is open so John, who's in the next room, can hear everything they're saying. And we see Seth is yelling, "What's wrong with you? I was only talking to her for God's sake. She's an old friend." And Annette screams back, "You were kissing her, Seth. Do you think I am stupid? Am I not enough for you?" And I guess this really angers Seth because he reaches out and he grabs her by the neck and he says, "You freaking stupid bitch. You think you're so freaking special, don't you? All you're bloody good for is the length, you whore. Get the hell out of my house right now." And because Seth got aggressive and actually grabbed her, John runs in the room and says, "Christ almighty, Seth, you'll hurt her." But Seth pushes her down and says, "Screw her." Then we cut back to present day homeless John, and Coney is asking him, "Yeah, what's so bloody magic about all this?" And then John replies, "That's where I come in." Then we cut back to John's story, and we see John is standing in front of Annette as she sits on a bed and cries, and he's saying, "Annette, come on, love, don't cry." And a teary-eyed Annette looks up and says, You are John? Seth says you are the wizard." And John replies, "Seth hasn't a clue. Do you want a brandy or something?" And then she looks up at John and says, "I want to get out of this place, John. Please." And then John's narration says, "How could you say no to that?" So then we cut to them arriving at John's place, and he's pouring them a drink, and he says, "Got no brandy. I'll change the sheets on the bed. You can get some kip. I'll take the couch." And as Annette's walking through his apartment, she's looking at his bookshelf and seeing all the occultic and magic books on there. And she says, "You are very kind. Is this your magician's cave? You have some lovely things." And John answers, "It's more of a dabbler's hovel, love." And then as she looks closer, she sees the books are pretty old and she says, "Oh, I love old books. Are these your spells, huh?" And John smiles and says, "Well, most of it's bollocks." And then out of nowhere, I guess she's trying to move things along, she asks the question, "You use your spells to charm the young girls, John? To have your wicked way?" And John kind of smiles at her and says, "I don't need magic for that." And then she gives him a look back and says, "No, I do not think you would." And then John's narration under that look says, "I was thinking, not tonight for God's sake. Not straight away. Think of old Seth." Then we cut to a panel of John and Annette making love, and John's narration says, "Bollocks to Seth." Then we see once they're done making love, John is sleeping on the bed, but Annette is not sleeping. She's up and she's reading John's magic books, specifically one called Leviticus Infernal. And John's narration says, "Believe me, she was good. I didn't once twig what she was up to." Then we cut to present, and homeless John is talking to Coney saying, "He hadn't hit her, but he came bloody close. And that can be nearly as scary for women, you know. Reminds them you can do a lot more damage than they can do to you. Every bloody night for 3 months, she was at them books. And she was a languages student." Then we cut back to the story, and we get a panel of John having sex with Annette again, and his narration says, "Like I said, I didn't notice." Then we cut to John and Seth hanging out on the couch, and John's narration says, "So one night, I'm around at Seth's, feeling pretty shitty because he doesn't know about me and Annette yet." And then we see John say to Seth, "You haven't heard from her, have you?" And Seth answers, "Funny you should say that, mate. She showed up again last night, right out of the blue." And then you see immediately John has a look of concern on his face, but Seth continues saying, She's giving me another chance, John. Christ, I don't deserve it. I was such a shit to her. But this time, I really want to make a go of it. Make it work. Then Annette comes out of the bedroom and all she's wearing is a robe. And she looks at the two and says, "Hi, John. I'm getting cold, Seth." And John just looks kind of in shock at this. And Seth tells Annette, "In there in a tick, love." And then he stands up and he turns to John and says, "You can let yourself out, can't you, mate?" And John looks just very confused at this moment. And he says, "Sure." And then Seth walks into the bedroom and John walks out of the apartment. And as the door closes behind John, he says, "Struth." And then as he walks out of the building, all of a sudden, he runs into a frantic woman who's waiting just outside the building. And this woman is Annette, but she looks very frazzled. And as John exits the door, she says, "Seth? John, what are you doing here?" And once again, John is confused. And he looks at her and says, "But you're with..." And then she begins to cry and puts her head in her hands and says, "Oh my God, my God. Oh, John, I have..." And then she looks at John wild-eyed with tears in her eyes and says, "I was so angry, so wrong. How could I? I read your books, John. I made a deal." And John replies, "With who?" And Annette answers, The third of the..." And immediately John is very alarmed and he runs back up the stairs into the building, up to Seth's flat, and he's yelling, "Jesus Christ, Seth!" Then we cut to Seth's bedroom where we see him and the woman that he thinks is Annette are having sex, and let's just say she's really encouraging him in the moment. And he seems to be enjoying himself quite a bit. So mid-thrust, John bursts open the bedroom door and yells, "Seth!" And Seth turns very angrily and says, "What? Constantine? For frig's sake! Piss off, will you? Close the bastard door!" And John just stands there like he's seeing something Seth isn't, and he says, It's not her, mate." And just as he says that, the real Annette comes out behind John, and Seth sees her, and he takes a second to process, and then he looks down at the Annette in front of him on the bed, and she is just giving him the creepiest smile ever. And keep in mind, Seth is still inside of her at the moment. Then we cut to present-day John talking to Coney, and he says, "And it's squeezed." And Coney's face is funny here. He's just like staring off like, oh my God. Then we cut back to the story in the bedroom and we hear Seth yell out, "No!" Ah! And Annette is staring at this with horror, but John is already on his way out and he's yelling to her, "Run for Christ's sake, you stupid cow, run!" And when she doesn't move, he continues saying, "Screw this." So John leaves and Annette just stands there frozen and she seems terrified because her face goes super pale. And as she watches, John's narration says, "The third of the three, the Lord of a billion faces, the shape changer." In the background, we could still hear Seth's screams, but then suddenly they stop. Then a chunk of bloody flesh lands at the feet of Annette, and we can assume that this is Seth's penis. And as she stands there in shock, we hear the third of the three say to her, "Be seeing you." Because like Annette said before, she made a deal with the third, so it's coming back for her soul at some point. Then we cut to present day, and Coney is asking, What happened to Annette?" And John replies, "Don't know. Could make a couple of rough guesses, though." And under that narration, we get a panel of the bloody arm of Annette hanging outside of a tub that's filled with blood and water, and a pair of bloody scissors on the floor beneath her arm. And I'm pretty sure this is just a guess of what John thinks probably happened, but who knows? So Coney thinks about all he's heard, and he says, "Well, I mean, why didn't you use your magic stuff to fix it all up? Why don't you use your magic to sort yourself out now? Stop living like shit." And then we get a panel of John, and his eyes are blacked out, like in shadow, as he thinks about Kit, and we get the ghost of Kit's face behind him, and he says, "'Cause I don't want to. I was too much like Seth." And then he shakes those memories, and he turns to Coney, who's holding the bottle of Jack Daniels, and Constantine nods to it and says, "You gonna give us a swig of that then?" And Coney hands him the bottle and says, "It's all yours." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this tangent story from Vertigo Jam number 1. It doesn't necessarily further the plot, but I think it does give a good characterization how John used to be when he was younger, and it just adds to the state he's in currently. And then also we get like an interesting story from his past that I've never heard of before. And the cool thing is this story is actually included in the collection for this story arc. So if you pick those up, you won't miss it. But I didn't know that until I found out about this issue and researched it a little bit. And next week, we're back on the normal series with issue 70. So until then, if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comic books, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.